A new study from George Washington University shows the U.S. has been cracking down on domestic ISIL recruits. There have been 56 related arrests so far in 2015, the most in a single year since 9/11. 40% of those arrested were converts to Islam. More than half of those suspects tried to travel overseas. About 70% were arrested in operations involving an informant or an undercover agent. Those FBI sting operations have helped locate potential recruits, but some Muslim community leaders are speaking out against this strategy. They say it's entrapment. Usher Qureshi reports.
You're doing yourself a favor by forgiving them and not...
The arrest of 19-year-old Muhammad Hamza Khan at O'Hare Airport in October of 2014 rattled the Chicago area Muslim community. FBI investigators say Khan was planning to fly from Chicago to Istanbul to join ISIL after buying 3 airline tickets for himself and his 2 siblings.
Many of the young people, they are really passionate and they are very concerned about what is happening in Syria. They make the wrong choices, going and joining ISIL or other terrorist organizations, which is illegal.
Before leaving, investigators say Khan wrote a 3-page letter to his parents explaining that he could no longer morally justify living in the U.S. I simply cannot sit here and let my brothers and sisters get killed with my own hard-earned money.
And we condemn the brainwashing and recruiting.
At a court appearance, Khan's mother spoke directly to those she held responsible.
And we have a message for ISIS, Mr. Baghdadi and his fellow social media recruiters. Leave our children alone.
Khan's attorney, Tom Durkin, specializes in cases like this and says law enforcement's attempt to predict future dangerousness gets into murky territory.
The issue is somebody predisposed to commit the crime? That gets very, very difficult when you're talking about young kids. And I think that's part of the reason there's such a perception in the Muslim community that these kids are being entrapped.
In late October, Khan pleaded guilty to attempting to provide material support to a foreign terrorist organization. He now faces up to 15 years in federal prison.
I don't think there's any question he was brainwashed. I don't think there's any question he was taken advantage of.
With the rise of ISIL in the Middle East, there has been a renewed effort to counter potential threats on U.S. soil.
I have homegrown violent extremist investigations in every single state.
And there's been a notable increase in ISIL-related arrests. From March 2014 to June 22, 2015, 56 people, mostly men, were charged in U.S. federal court with supporting ISIL. Since March 2015, there has been an increase in cases of individuals accused of plotting attacks in the U.S. in the name of ISIL. One of them was 20-year-old John Booker Jr., charged with attempting to carry out a suicide bombing at the U.S. Army installation at Fort Riley, Kansas. Booker had been on the FBI's radar for more than 6 months, attending prayers here at the Islamic Center of Topeka.
Several months after, he began to come, I got a call from the FBI agent.
Omar Hazin is the center's imam and an Islamic advisor to the Kansas Department of Corrections. He says the FBI asked him to counsel Booker, who they say had posted alarming messages online about waging jihad.
The posting was saying that John indicated that he wanted to become a martyr. He was ready to meet Allah, and that he was ready to join a jihad.
At what point did you realize that he needed more than just spiritual guidance?
Well, I think after maybe 2 or 3 weeks after we began to talk, so he told me he had been on medication. Then I had discussed with the FBI agent to see if we could try to get him, if they could try to get him help along with the Islamic Center working. Mental health help.
In an unclassified FBI report, investigators say Booker checked himself into a mental health facility and noted that he did not have access to a vehicle or possess firearms. Despite Booker's documented history of mental illness, 8 months later, federal investigators say an FBI informant told Booker he had a cousin who could get people overseas and asked Booker what he wanted to do. Booker answered, anything you think is good, I will follow you. The informant then told Booker that if he said he was ready to fight, he would have to prove it. Booker responded, I will kill any kuffar, non-believer. I will follow any place. He was provided with what he thought was an explosive-filled van. Federal investigators say Booker drove the van to what he believed to be a little-used utility gate that would allow him to enter Fort Riley undetected. They say once on base, Booker planned to detonate the explosive device to kill as many soldiers as possible. The bomb was a fake. Booker was arrested and now faces life in prison.
FBI agents and Joint Terrorism Task Force officers in Minnesota and California arrested 6 men.
But the investigation fits a pattern of cases.
Concerned that social media is pulling in young people and recruiting them, and this
often paraded out by authorities that rely heavily on sting operations.
He espoused violent jihad, and that he did constitute a threat to those of us in the United States.
The FBI in Kansas would not comment on the ongoing John Booker Jr. investigation.
If somebody's expressing ideas that the government thinks are troubling, they feel it's appropriate for the government then to come in and push them along.
Mike German spent 16 years with the FBI, specializing in undercover work and domestic terrorism. He is critical of the sting tactics.
Because there are real bad people out there, and half of the violent crime in this country goes unsolved, including 1/3 of the murders and 60% of the rapes. For the government to spend the kind of resources that are necessary for an undercover sting operation distracts from those real cases.
The FBI did not grant Al Jazeera's requests for an interview with FBI Director James Comey, but in response to criticisms last year, he wrote, "Every undercover operation involves deception, which has long been a critical tool in fighting crime. The FBI's use of such techniques is subject to close oversight, both internally and by the courts that review our work." We asked leaders here in Chicago what law enforcement should do instead.
We've asked them, look, if you find somebody on the path to radicalization, what do you do about them? Well, you encourage them to commit a crime and then catch them. Why don't you have a program of rehabilitation for them? Rather than letting them continue the radicalization path, pull them back.
In the absence of those measures, there is concern in the American Muslim community that those vulnerable to online ISIL predators may choose the wrong path. Usher Qureshi, Al Jazeera, Fort Riley, Kansas.
And let's continue the conversation with our panel tonight. Dr. Ghanta Ahmed, she is a Huffington Post contributor and the author of In the Land of Invisible Women. Hussein Rashid is professor of religion at Hofstra University. And Imam Talib Abdur-Rashid is the imam of the Mosque of the Islamic Brotherhood in New York. Welcome to all of you. It's good to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Let me start with the whole idea of entrapment, Dr. Ahmed. I mean, do you believe that the government is trying to entrap Muslims who otherwise wouldn't commit crimes?
I think the American government is faced with an impossible task. We do know that there is an ideology that seduces the vulnerable, which I call Islamism. It's an impostor of Islam, and it preys on vulnerable individuals who begin with an idea to participate in a narrative as jihadists. And so there is an intention and there are language and ideas which are expressed. So if we're going to try and arrest this, we do need to know about those dialogues and conversations.
But Imam, is there one Islam or are there many?
There's one Islam. There are many different perspectives or understandings of that one Islam. But additionally, going to your original question, the use of entrapment, I think that is criminal. The way that the FBI right now and in the past constantly targets people who are mentally ill, people who are marginally intelligent, and then entraps them in these ruses and then parades them out in front of cameras.
So Hussein, does the United States government really have a responsibility to rehabilitate these people?
Well, you can't rehabilitate somebody who isn't charged with a crime. What we're seeing instead is a misuse or misdirection of resources. And the fact that this report is coming on the heels of the video we see coming out of Chicago, what we see is law enforcement run amok. This is not independent of local policing and Black Lives Matters issues, where it's just we need quick and easy wins without actually making the communities more safer, in which law enforcement.
No legitimate threat?
There's always a legitimate threat, but there's smarter ways to go about doing this, which doesn't rely on entrapment, doesn't rely on mass surveillance, and involves serious community partnership with law enforcement responsibility.
All right, let's talk about the question of whether Islam is associated with the Islamic State. You all say no?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. Why?
No more.
It's called the Islamic State.
Yeah, but the Ku Klux Klan called themselves white Christian knights. And as they have murdered people throughout the centuries, people don't expect for evangelical preachers or mainstream preachers to say, well, you know, this is not associated with our religion.
But if I can interject,
Absolutely.
It's a little bit more complicated. I agree. The Islamic State, as it calls itself, does not represent any Islamic value. However, it is birthed of an ideology called Islamism. And Islamism could not exist without stealing our religion, our metaphors, our theology, and distorting it into a political totalitarianism. So Islamic State does not represent Islam, but it is a corruption of our faith and therefore has a relationship to it.
It has a relationship. You agree?
You know, I'm even cautious using the term Islamic State because I don't think it's a term that they use for themselves. They're the state, the Islamist state of Iraq and Syria.
Daesh, but it uses Islam in it as well,
which is also Islamist, not Islamic.
How do you? I mean,
right?
I understand.
It's a
minute difference.
It is a minute difference because it doesn't allow it doesn't give them the authority to speak on our part. You've got to understand that their #1 victims are other Muslims. The people they're out to kill most often, most frequently, most regularly are other Muslims. The people most willing to reject them are in fact Muslims. And so for them to have this title Islamic is problematic.
That's true, but for your viewers, this is not a minute difference. There is a chasm of difference between Islam, the monotheism, and Islamism, which is an absolute perversion. The words sound similar, but the ideologies could not be more radically different. And they would be as different as everyone cites the example Nazism came to power through democracy, but represented nothing of democracy. Islamism is exactly that relationship. It's an alien and anathema, but it is connected.
You understand why that's hard for some people in this country to understand?
I can understand it, but we have a phrase here in America, using the good name of God to shield one's own dirty religion. And one should, in looking at these groups that couch themselves in Islamic phrases and quote the Quran, I repeat, they are no more representative of Islam and Muslims than the KKK is of Christianity and the Bible.
There's a lot of talk in this country about Muslims should stand up. Muslims should speak out about what's going on. Let me read this quote from Imani Jamal, a Princeton University professor that came from the New York Times. It said, "Where is the panel this morning on the Sunday talk shows where you have Muslim leaders alongside Western leaders to talk about how they're going to conquer this problem? Instead, you'll get panels of Western leaders and public policy intellectuals telling you what they will do about Muslims, talking at Muslims."
Absolutely.
So, is there a responsibility for Muslims to speak out about this or not?
Yes, and we've been doing so openly and vociferously, particularly since 9/11. You know, as a member of the Muslim community, like my fellow panelists here, you know, we're sick of people asking us, when are you going to speak out?
Right.
When we are constantly speaking out.
But if
that's really a question that needs to be directed toward the media, not toward us.
But in fairness, I would say, I was just in Paris during these events, and we did have the King of Jordan, the King of Saudi Arabia, and numerous Muslim leaders condemning it. However, Muslim leaders globally are not doing enough to admit the origins of Islamism and extract it from within some forms of their government and some clerics who are deviant and who are promoting Islamism.
So how do you address that problem?
So I want to echo what my colleague here said. Muslims have been denouncing it for years. In English, there's a website up that lists 500 pages of denouncements that come out on a regular basis.
But you heard what Dr. Ahmed said. She said that there are imams that are preaching this in their mosques.
But what percentage are we talking about? Yeah. That's the thing.
Well,
we're not talking about a large percentage. We're talking about people who are denouncing it, senior people, whether it's the Amman message, whether it's a common word, whether it's the letter to al-Baghdadi. I mean, you have senior people who are coming out and saying, this is not who we are. You have vast numbers of Muslims saying, who gets to decide who gets to speak?
And to show you that it's not black and white, I agree with the professor here, because actually for over a century, it is Muslims who have come out and condemned Islamism since its 1920s origin in Egyptian prisons. So Muslims are often the ones losing their lives. And in terms of the preaching of deviant Islam, we know from the country of my origin, Pakistan, where that's happening in many madrasas, and Pakistani military is engaged in fierce combat with that.
So let me take my country of origin is America. And we who who are Muslims in America, we are not responsible for what other people say and do in other countries.
Let me talk about Islamophobia for a second, because we've gone pretty fast here, and I've got a lot more to get to. Roll the soundbite with Donald Trump.
I want surveillance of certain mosques, okay? If that's okay. And you know what? We've had it before and we'll have it again. I will absolutely take database on the people coming in from Syria if we can't stop it, but we're going to. And if I win, I've made it known, if I win, they're going back. We can't have them.
Since Paris, has there been a backlash?
I think that there's been a rising xenophobia towards Muslims acutely since Paris, expressed in the refusal to take Syrian refugees, which is being promoted by 26 U.S. governors. Yes, I think there's a new level of hysteria. But I would distinguish xenophobia towards anything that can be identified as Muslim from Islamophobia, which is often used.
What's the difference?
Islamophobia is claimed to be a criticism or a denial or a refusal to scrutinize anything to do with Islam, promoted not by confident Muslims who are very engaged in their faith, but promoted by Islamists who would not like to be subject to scrutiny. So there are two things. Certainly Donald Trump and Ben Carson, a fellow physician, are responsible for rising the tone of xenophobia in the current discourse.
How do you respond to Donald Trump, Imam?
He's either being woefully ignorant or being intentionally deceptive. He mentioned surveillance of mosques. The fact is that in America, there are mosques that have been surveilled with right here in New York City. We just went through years of that. Mosques are not the recruiting places for violent, Muslim violent extremists.
Never.
The surveillance of mosques in America has not turned up Muslim violent extremists. Most of the extremists have been recruited in the street, outside of the mosque, and all you have to do is just check the record.
I mean, you understand.
Apart from those mentally ill people who attend mosques who have been entrapped.
But they're not all mentally ill people, are
No,
they?
but a good deal of them are.
They're not all mentally ill, and I think that's a cop-out across the board, whether you're shooting up a Planned Parenthood clinic or you're going into a church.
So there's a double standard?
Of course there's a huge double standard, but I think it's a question of, it's not all mental health related, but I think people are picking on the lowest hanging fruit. So Daesh is going after people who are at the margins of society. Law enforcement is going after the people who are at the margins of society.
Right.
That is inextricably linked to questions of mental health, economic access, education, right? I mean, so across the board, these people are being victimized on multiple levels.
So why is it so hard in the United States to label anyone who commits a violent act and isn't Muslim a terrorist?
That's an important political question as we await the designation of this man that just killed or murdered those people at the Planned Parenthood clinic. I mean, we're waiting. He has not been designated a terrorist, not yet. The man who walked into a church in South Carolina and murdered people has not been designated as a terrorist. But I guarantee you, if they had been Muslim, then they would have been designated terrorists, and again, people would be pointing the finger at Islam.
Our time has flown by. It's great to have you on the program. We'll have you back and continue this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Appreciate it.
We look forward to it.
Coming up next.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.